The old clock on the wall read 5:30 in the morning when Robert Hayes pushed open the heavy metal doors of Lincoln High School. The hallways were dark and silent just the way he liked them. He'd been doing the same routine for 35 years now, arriving before the sun came up, leaving long after it went down. At 62 years old, his body knew every corner of this building better than his own apartment. Robert was the kind of man people looked right through. Not in a mean way, exactly. It's just that nobody really sees the person mopping the floors or fixing the broken water fountains. To the kids rushing between classes, he was just part of the furniture. To the teachers juggling lesson plans and grading papers, he was background noise, and Robert had made peace with that a long time ago. He wore the same navy blue work uniform every day, with his name stitched in faded red thread over the pocket. His lunch was always the same too: 2 sandwiches wrapped in aluminum foil, an apple, and a thermos of black coffee. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would make anyone look twice, but if you paid attention, really paid attention, you might notice something odd. Every week there was a different book sticking out of Robert's back pocket. One week it might be a thick volume of Shakespeare. The next it could be a philosophy book or a collection of poems. He'd pull it out during his 15-minute breaks, sitting on the loading dock behind the school, reading while he ate his lunch. The thing about being invisible is that you get to observe a lot. Robert had watched thousands of kids walk these halls over the decades. He'd seen them stressed about exams, excited about football games, heartbroken over their first breakups. He'd seen teachers come and go, some burning out after a year, others dedicating their entire lives to the job. And through it all, Robert kept learning. He'd never finished high school himself. Had to drop out at 16 when his mother got sick. Someone needed to work, to pay the bills, to keep food on the table. Education became a luxury he couldn't afford. But that didn't stop him from being curious. That didn't stop him from wanting to know things. Every evening after work, Robert would stop by the public library. He'd gotten to know the librarians so well they'd set aside books they thought he'd like. He took online courses late at night, sitting at his kitchen table with his old laptop, completing assignments that nobody would ever grade. He filled notebook after notebook with his thoughts, his questions, his attempts to make sense of the world. The new school year brought changes, as it always did. Fresh faces in the classrooms, teachers rearranging their rooms, the smell of new textbooks and floor wax mixing in the air. One of those changes was Ms. Rodriguez, a young English teacher starting her first year at Lincoln High. Unlike most people, Ms. Rodriguez had a habit of actually looking at people. Not just glancing, but really seeing them. She noticed things, like how Robert always held doors open for students even when his arms were full of cleaning supplies, how he'd quietly pick up dropped papers and leave them on the nearest desk, how he'd hum classical music while he worked. It was October when she first spotted the book. Robert was replacing a burned-out light bulb in the hallway outside her classroom, and there it was, a worn copy of Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays peeking out from his pocket. The next week, she saw him reading Langston Hughes. The week after that, Virginia Woolf. Ms. Rodriguez found herself getting curious. She'd watch him during her planning period, sitting on a bench near the gym, deeply absorbed in whatever he was reading. He'd underline passages, write notes in the margins, flip back and forth between pages like he was having a conversation with the author. One day in late November, she walked past the janitor's closet and noticed the door was slightly open. Inside, she could see Robert's lunchbox sitting on a shelf. Next to it was a small stack of books and 3 leather-bound notebooks. She shouldn't have looked. She knew that. But something made her pause. The notebook on top was open, and she could see Robert's handwriting, neat, careful letters forming sentences about the nature of work and dignity. About how society judges people based on what they do rather than who they are. The words were beautiful, thoughtful, the kind of writing she wished her students could produce. Ms. Rodriguez quickly stepped back, feeling like she'd intruded on something private. But she couldn't stop thinking about what she'd seen. Here was this man pushing a mop and fixing toilets who was clearly more educated than half the people with college degrees walking these halls. She started paying even closer attention. During lunch one day, she noticed Robert sitting alone in the cafeteria after the students had left, reading and eating his sandwich. The book this time was Plato's Republic. She decided to take a chance. Walking over to his table, she asked if she could join him. Robert looked surprised, almost uncomfortable, but he nodded. They made small talk at first, about the weather, about the upcoming winter break, about nothing important. But then Ms. Rodriguez mentioned she'd noticed his reading habits. Robert's face turned red. He looked down at his sandwich like it was the most interesting thing in the world. But Ms. Rodriguez pressed gently, asking what he thought of the book. And slowly, carefully, Robert began to talk. His voice was quiet, uncertain at first, but as he spoke about Plato's ideas, about justice and the ideal society, his words gained confidence. He had opinions, insights, connections to other books and other thinkers. Ms. Rodriguez found herself leaning forward, genuinely engaged in the conversation. When the bell rang for the next period, they both seemed surprised at how much time had passed. As Robert gathered his things to get back to work, Ms. Rodriguez knew something important had just happened. She'd discovered something extraordinary hiding in plain sight, and somehow she had a feeling this was just the beginning. Robert walked away, pushing his cleaning cart down the empty hallway, not knowing that his carefully hidden world of books and learning was about to change everything. The next few weeks changed everything for Robert Hayes. Though he didn't realize it at first, Ms. Rodriguez started showing up during his lunch breaks more often. Not every day, that would have been obvious, but maybe twice a week. They'd talk about books, about ideas, about things that Robert had only ever discussed with himself in those notebooks he kept hidden away. At first, Robert was nervous, suspicious even. In 35 years, nobody had ever cared what he thought about anything beyond whether the toilets were working or if the gym floor was properly waxed. Why would this young teacher, fresh out of college with her whole career ahead of her, want to waste her time talking to an old janitor? But Ms. Rodriguez seemed genuinely interested. She'd ask him questions that made him think. She'd challenge his interpretations of books. She'd recommend new authors and actually remember their conversations from week to week. Slowly, Robert began to trust that this wasn't some kind of joke or social experiment. One cold December afternoon, Ms. Rodriguez asked him a question that caught him off guard. They were sitting in the empty cafeteria discussing a novel they'd both read when she said, "Robert, did you ever think about going to college?" The question hung in the air between them. Robert stared at his half-eaten sandwich for a long moment. Nobody had asked him that in decades. "I didn't finish high school," he said quietly. "Had to leave in 10th grade. My mother got really sick, cancer, and somebody needed to work. My dad had passed away when I was little, so it was just us. The medical bills kept piling up. I got a job at a factory, and that was that." Ms. Rodriguez nodded, not with pity but with understanding. "But you didn't stop learning?" "No," Robert said, a small smile crossing his face. "No, I couldn't stop that. Even when I was working double shifts at the factory, I'd go to the library on Sundays. I'd read anything I could get my hands on. When I got the job here at the school, it was like being surrounded by learning all the time. I'd sit outside classrooms during my breaks, listening to the teachers lecture. I'd read the books that students left behind. Eventually, I found out about online courses, free ones where you could learn just for the sake of learning." "How long have you been doing the online courses?" Ms. Rodriguez asked. "About 12 years now. I've probably taken 50 or 60 of them. History, literature, philosophy, even some science courses. I do all the assignments, write all the papers, even though nobody's ever going to grade them or give me credit." Ms. Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You know that's remarkable, right? Most people wouldn't have that kind of dedication." Robert shrugged. "It's not dedication. It's just, I can't not do it. Learning is like breathing for me. It's who I am, even if nobody else knows it." The conversation stuck with Ms. Rodriguez. That weekend, she couldn't stop thinking about Robert and his secret life as a scholar. On Monday, she took a risk. "Robert," she said during their lunch conversation, "would you let me read something you've written?" His face went pale. "I don't think, please. Just one thing. Something from those notebooks I saw." Robert froze. "You saw my notebooks?" "I'm sorry," Ms. Rodriguez said quickly. "The closet door was open one day and I saw them sitting there. I only read a few lines, I swear. But Robert, those few lines were beautiful. You're a real writer." For a long moment, Robert didn't say anything. Then he stood up, grabbed his cleaning cart, and walked away without a word. Ms. Rodriguez sat there, worried she'd pushed too hard, crossed a line she shouldn't have crossed. 2 days passed. Robert avoided the cafeteria during lunch. He kept his head down when he saw Ms. Rodriguez in the hallways. She felt terrible. like she'd ruined the one genuine friendship she'd made at the school. But on the third day, Robert appeared at her classroom door after school. The students had all left. He stood there, holding a single piece of paper, his hand trembling slightly. "This is something I wrote a few months ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can read it if you want, but please don't show anyone else. And please don't tell me what you think of it to my face. If it's bad, just throw it away and we'll never talk about it again." Before Ms. Rodriguez could respond, Robert turned and walked quickly down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Ms. Rodriguez looked down at the paper in her hand. The title at the top read, "The Scholar in Coveralls." She sat at her desk and began to read. The essay was about dignity, about how society decides who deserves respect based on job titles and tax brackets. It talked about the assumptions people make when they see someone in a work uniform, how they automatically dismiss that person as less intelligent, less worthy of consideration. But it also talked about the freedom in being invisible, the ability to observe and learn without the pressure of performance or status. Robert wrote about the conversations he'd overheard in the hallways over the years, students stressing about getting into the right college, teachers complaining about standardized tests, parents obsessing over GPAs and class rankings. He wrote about how education had become transactional, a means to an end rather than something valuable in itself. The writing was clear, thoughtful, and powerful. It had a voice that was both humble and confident, someone who'd spent years thinking deeply about these ideas. Ms. Rodriguez found herself reading it 3 times, each time finding new layers of meaning. When she finished, she sat back in her chair, stunned. This wasn't just good writing. This was the kind of essay she'd use as a model for her students. This was the kind of thinking she hoped to inspire in her classroom. The next day, she found Robert cleaning the windows near the main office. "I read it," she said simply. Robert stopped wiping, his shoulders tensing. He didn't turn around. "It's one of the best essays I've ever read," Ms. Rodriguez continued, "and I have a master's degree in English. I've read thousands of essays. Yours is special, Robert." He finally turned to face her, his eyes searching her face for signs of mockery or pity. He found neither. "You're just being nice," he said. "I'm not. And I want to ask you something, but you can say no. I promise it won't change anything between us." Robert waited, his jaw tight. "I want to share this essay with my students. Not your name, just the essay itself. I think they need to read this. They need to hear these ideas." "No," Robert said immediately. "Absolutely not." "Okay," Ms. Rodriguez said, respecting his answer. "I understand." They stood there in the hallway, the sound of distant classroom chatter floating through the air. "Why not?" Robert asked after a moment. "Why not what? Why do you think they need to read it?" Ms. Rodriguez chose her words carefully. "Because most of my students think education is just about getting grades and getting out. They've forgotten, or maybe nobody ever taught them, that learning can be its own reward. Your essay reminds people of that. It challenges the way we think about intelligence and worth." "That's powerful, Robert. That's important." Robert didn't answer. He went back to cleaning the windows, but Ms. Rodriguez could see his mind working, considering possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider before. That night, sitting in his small apartment, Robert pulled out all his notebooks. Years and years of thoughts, essays, and observations. He'd always written for himself, never imagining anyone else would read his words. But maybe, just maybe, Ms. Rodriguez was right. Maybe his words could matter to someone other than himself. He picked up his phone and sent a short text. "You can share the essay, but don't tell them who wrote it." In her apartment across town, Ms. Rodriguez smiled when she saw the message. She had a feeling this small permission was going to lead to something much bigger than either of them could imagine. Ms. Rodriguez spent the entire weekend preparing for Monday's class. She made copies of Robert's essay, carefully removing any identifying information. She planned discussion questions, thought about how to introduce it, rehearsed what she'd say. This felt important in a way that most lesson plans didn't. Monday morning arrived with the usual chaos. Students shuffled into her senior English class, dropping backpacks, checking phones, complaining about homework from other classes. Ms. Rodriguez waited for them to settle, then held up the stack of papers. "We're doing something different today," she announced. "I want you to read this essay. It's called The Scholar in Coveralls, and it was written by someone you don't know. After you read it, we're going to discuss it." A student named Tyler raised his hand. Is this going to be on the test? No test. Just thinking. The class groaned good-naturedly, but they took the papers and started reading. Ms. Rodriguez watched their faces as they worked through the essay. Some students skimmed quickly, barely engaging. But others, she could see it happening, something was clicking. They'd slow down, go back and reread a paragraph, underline a sentence. When most of them had finished, Ms. Rodriguez opened the floor for discussion. So, she said, what did you think? Silence at first. Then a girl named Rachel spoke up. It's different from most essays we read. It feels real, like an actual person wrote it, not someone trying to sound smart. What makes it feel real? Ms. Rodriguez asked. The way they talk about work, Rachel continued. My mom's a nurse and she always says people treat her differently when she's in her scrubs versus when she's in regular clothes. This essay gets that. More hands went up. The discussion took off in directions Ms. Rodriguez hadn't anticipated. Students started sharing their own experiences with being judged or dismissed. They debated whether education should be practical or pursued for its own sake. They talked about their parents' jobs, their own part-time work, the way society valued certain paths over others. A quiet student named Kevin, who rarely participated, raised his hand. Whoever wrote this, Kevin said, they're not a teacher, are they? What makes you say that? Ms. Rodriguez asked. Because teachers always talk about education in this hopeful way, like it solves everything. This person sounds like they had to fight for every bit of learning they got, like it cost them something. The class went silent, considering this observation. You're right, Ms. Rodriguez said. The author isn't a teacher. They're someone who never had the opportunities most of us take for granted. But they never stopped learning anyway. Who is it? Several students asked at once. I promised I wouldn't say, but they're closer than you think. That cryptic answer sparked intense speculation. For the rest of the week, students in Ms. Rodriguez's class were obsessed with identifying the mystery author. They came up with theories. Maybe it was a parent. Maybe it was someone who worked at the local college. Maybe it was Ms. Rodriguez herself using a pen name. One student, though, was more observant than the others. Her name was Beth, and she had a reputation for noticing details other people missed. She'd always been that way. The kid who spotted continuity errors in movies, who could tell when someone was lying by the way they moved their hands. Beth had read the essay 3 times now. Something about the phrase, the scholar in coveralls, kept nagging at her. Coverall suggested physical work. The essay talked about being invisible, about observing hallways and classrooms, about being dismissed based on appearance. On Thursday afternoon, Beth was leaving the library when she saw Robert fixing a broken door handle. She'd passed him 1,000 times before without really looking at him. But this time she stopped. There was a book in his back pocket. She couldn't see the title, but she could see the worn edges, the way it had been read multiple times. On his cart, partially covered by cleaning supplies, was a notebook. Beth's heart started racing. Could it be? She thought about the handwriting on the essay. The copies Ms. Rodriguez had made were printed, but Beth had noticed the original annotations in Ms. Rodriguez's handwriting on the teacher's copy. But wait, there was something else. Last month, Robert had fixed Beth's jammed locker. He'd left a note explaining what had been wrong and how he'd fixed it. She'd kept that note, thought it was nice that he'd bothered to explain. Beth rushed to her locker and dug through her backpack until she found the note. She pulled out her copy of the essay. The handwriting wasn't identical. The note was quickly scribbled, the essay carefully typed, but there were similarities. The way he made his lowercase a's, the way he crossed his t's. But more than that, the voice felt the same. Both were humble but intelligent. Both paid attention to details. Both had a quiet dignity to them. Beth knew she could be wrong. This could be wishful thinking, seeing patterns that weren't there. But she had to know. The next day, Beth waited until after school. She found Robert cleaning the hallway near the gym, the same spot where he usually took his afternoon break. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Mr. Hayes?" Robert looked up, surprised. Most students didn't know his last name. "Yes? I have a question, and I promise I'll keep the answer to myself if you want me to. But I need to know." Robert set down his mop, giving her his full attention. Up close, Beth could see his eyes were kind but cautious. "Did you write The Scholar in Coveralls?" Robert's face went through several emotions in quick succession. Shock, fear, resignation, and finally something that might have been relief. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked, "How did you figure it out?" "The note you left on my locker. And the way you're always reading." And the essay talked about observing hallways and classrooms from the outside. It just fit. Robert leaned against his cleaning cart, suddenly looking very tired. "Are you going to tell everyone?" "That depends," Beth said. "Do you want me to?" "No, God, no. Can you imagine? Everyone would look at me differently. They'd either pity me or think I was putting on airs. I just want to do my job and read my books." Beth nodded slowly. "But don't you think your story could help people? I mean, that essay, it made me think differently about everything. About why I'm even going to college. About what matters. I'm glad it helped you," Robert said genuinely. "But that doesn't mean I need to be the face of it." "Okay," Beth said. "I won't tell anyone. But can I ask you something else?" "I suppose. Why do you do it?" "The reading, the learning, all of it. If nobody knows, if you don't get any credit, why keep going?" Robert smiled for the first time in the conversation. "Because it makes me who I am. Because when I read a great book or understand a difficult concept, I feel more alive than any other time. Because learning isn't about impressing people or getting a better job. It's about becoming more fully yourself." Beth felt tears prick her eyes, though she wasn't sure why. "That's beautiful." "Don't go soft on me, kid," Robert said, but his voice was gentle. "You've got class to get to." As Beth walked away, she felt changed somehow. She discovered something extraordinary hiding in plain sight, and she had to decide what to do with that knowledge. That weekend, Beth couldn't stop thinking about Robert. She thought about all the people in the world like him, brilliant minds trapped in circumstances that didn't allow them to shine. She thought about how society measured worth and intelligence. She thought about the essay and how it had affected her classmates. By Monday morning, Beth had made a decision. She found Ms. Rodriguez before first period. "I know who wrote the essay," Beth said. Ms. Rodriguez looked up from her desk, careful not to confirm or deny. "And I think he should speak to the whole school," Beth continued. "I think everyone needs to hear his story. Not just our class, everyone." "That's not my decision to make," Ms. Rodriguez said carefully. "And even if it were, the author has been very clear about wanting privacy." "I know. But what if we could convince him? What if we showed him that his story could change things?" Ms. Rodriguez studied Beth's determined face. "What are you proposing?" "I don't know yet," Beth admitted. "But I know we have to try." And with that, a plan began to form. A plan that would take Robert's carefully hidden life and thrust it into the light. Whether he was ready for it or not, Robert knew something was up when Beth started appearing everywhere. She'd show up during his lunch breaks with questions about books. She'd linger in hallways he was cleaning, making conversation. She'd brought 2 of her friends by to introduce themselves, which Robert found deeply suspicious. Teenagers didn't just introduce themselves to janitors. He was right to be suspicious. Beth had recruited a small group of students who'd been moved by the essay. Together, they'd started what they called the Hidden Scholars Project. The idea was simple but ambitious. Find and celebrate the wisdom of people in their community whose knowledge went unrecognized because of their jobs or circumstances. They started small. Beth interviewed the lunch lady who spoke 4 languages. Another student talked to the school security guard who taught himself computer programming. They created a blog, posted videos, shared stories. Within 2 weeks, the project had hundreds of followers among students and parents. But Robert was the story they really wanted to tell, the one that started it all. Ms. Rodriguez watched all of this unfold with mixed feelings. She was proud of her students' initiative. The project was exactly the kind of critical thinking and social awareness she hoped to inspire. But she also felt protective of Robert, who hadn't asked for any of this attention. One afternoon, she pulled Beth aside. "What you're doing is wonderful," Ms. Rodriguez said, "but you need to be careful. Robert is a private person. You can't force him into the spotlight." "I'm not forcing him," Beth protested. "I'm just trying to show him that his voice matters, that his story could inspire people. To you, maybe. But to him, this might feel like exposure, not inspiration. You have to respect his boundaries." Beth looked frustrated but nodded. She understood intellectually what Ms. Rodriguez was saying. But emotionally, she felt like they were sitting on something important, something that could change how people thought about education and worth. The Hidden Scholars Project continued to grow. Local news picked up the story. The principal, Dr. Patricia Morrison, called Beth and the other student leaders into her office. Robert heard about the meeting from another custodian and felt his stomach drop. That evening, Dr. Morrison did something unusual. She went to Robert's apartment. Robert answered the door in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, shocked to see his boss standing there. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced," Dr. Morrison said, "but I wanted to talk to you somewhere private." Robert invited her in, embarrassed by his modest apartment but trying not to show it. Dr. Morrison sat at his small kitchen table, declining his offer of coffee. "I know about the essay," she said directly. "And before you panic, Beth didn't tell me. Ms. Rodriguez did, but only because she's worried about you. She wanted me to understand the situation before it got out of hand." Robert sank into the chair across from her. "I'm going to lose my job, aren't I?" "What? No, why would you think that?" "Because I've been, I don't know, lying, pretending to be something I'm not." Dr. Morrison shook her head. "Robert, you've been doing your job excellently for 35 years. What you do in your free time is your business. But I did want to talk to you about something." She pulled out a printed copy of his essay. Robert noticed she'd made notes in the margins. "This is remarkable writing," she said. "I have a doctorate in education, and I've read thousands of academic papers. This is better than most of them. More honest, more insightful." Robert didn't know what to say. "These students, the Hidden Scholars Project, they want you to speak at graduation, to share your story with the whole school. I want you to know that I support that idea, but only if you're comfortable with it." "I'm not," Robert said immediately. "I can't stand up in front of hundreds of people. I can barely handle conversations with one person." "I understand, but I also want you to think about something. You've spent 35 years being invisible, learning for yourself, keeping all this wisdom locked inside. What if sharing it could help even one student see learning differently, see themselves differently? What if they laugh at me? What if they think I'm pathetic? A 62-year-old janitor who's been playing pretend scholar." Dr. Morrison leaned forward. "Then they'd be wrong. And frankly, Robert, they'd be missing the entire point. You are a scholar. Self-taught is still taught. Education doesn't require permission from institutions." After she left, Robert sat at his kitchen table for hours, staring at his notebook stacked in the corner. 40 years of learning, of growth, of conversations with himself. What was it all for if it stayed locked away? The next day, Robert found Beth after school. "I heard about the graduation idea," he said without preamble. Beth looked nervous. "Mr. Hayes, I'm sorry if we overstepped. We just thought, I want to see what you've been working on. This Hidden Scholars Project." Beth's eyes widened. She pulled out her phone and showed him the blog, the videos, the interviews they'd conducted. Robert watched student after student talking about people in their lives who were brilliant but overlooked. He read comments from parents thanking them for changing how they saw people in service jobs. "This is good work," Robert said quietly. "Thank you. But honestly, your story is the one that inspired all of this." "You're the reason we started asking these questions?" Robert handed back her phone. "I need time to think about the graduation thing. But in the meantime, would you want to interview me for your project? Just a short conversation, maybe. We could keep it anonymous if needed." Beth's face lit up. "Really?" "Yes, absolutely." They set up the interview for the following week. Ms. Rodriguez helped, making sure the questions were respectful, that Robert had approval over anything before it was posted. When the day came, Robert was terrified, but he showed up. Beth asked him about his journey, his love of learning, what kept him going. Robert, once he started talking, found it easier than he'd expected. Beth had a way of asking questions that made him forget about the camera, that made him feel like they were just having a conversation. The video went up on a Friday evening. By Monday morning, it had been viewed over 10,000 times. Students stopped Robert in the hallways, not to ignore him but to thank him. Teachers who'd worked with him for years saw him with new eyes. It was overwhelming and uncomfortable, and strangely wonderful all at once. That week, something unexpected happened. A professor from the local community college saw the video. Her name was Dr. Helen Chen, and she taught adult education courses. She reached out to Dr. Morrison with an idea. Dr. Morrison called Robert into her office. He went, assuming he was in some kind of trouble. "I got an interesting call today," Dr. Morrison said, gesturing for him to sit, "from Dr. Chen at the community college. She saw your interview." Robert's stomach tightened. She wants to offer you a full scholarship. You could complete your high school equivalency and then pursue an associate's or bachelor's degree, if you wanted. All costs covered. Robert stared at her, unable to process what he was hearing. I don't understand. Why would they do that? Because your story matters, Robert. Because you represent something important, that learning isn't bound by age or circumstance. She thinks you could be an incredible advocate for adult learners. But I'm 62 years old. What's the point of getting a degree now? Dr. Morrison smiled. You've been learning for 40 years without a degree. Imagine what you could do with one. The credentials would give you a platform. You could teach, write, help other people like you. Or you could just learn for the sake of learning, except this time with access to resources you've never had. Robert went home that night and looked at his notebooks again. Then he looked up the community college website. He read about their programs, their mission statement, their focus on non-traditional students. For the first time in 40 years, he let himself imagine a different kind of life. One where his learning wasn't a secret, where his voice could reach beyond the walls of his small apartment. He picked up his phone and called Dr. Morrison. I'll speak at graduation, he said, and I'll take the scholarship. But I have one condition. What's that? I keep my job here, at least part-time. This school is my home. These students, even the ones who never noticed me, they're part of my story. Dr. Morrison laughed. I think we can arrange that. As Robert hung up the phone, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades, hope mixed with terror. The feeling of standing on the edge of something completely new. Graduation was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to prepare a speech that would expose everything he'd kept hidden. 3 weeks to decide if he was brave enough to step into the light. The 3 weeks before graduation passed in a blur. Robert spent every evening working on his speech, writing and rewriting until his small kitchen table was covered in crumpled papers. He'd never been so nervous about anything in his life. Ms. Rodriguez and Beth both offered to help, but Robert needed to do this himself. These were his words, his story. If he was going to stand in front of 500 people and bare his soul, it had to be authentic. The night before graduation, Robert couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if it was too late to back out. Who was he to give a speech? He was a janitor who'd never finished high school. What wisdom could he possibly offer to students who were moving on to college, to futures full of possibilities he'd never had? But then he thought about Beth, about the Hidden Scholars Project, about all those students who'd started seeing the world differently because of one essay. He thought about the scholarship waiting for him, about the chance to finally step out of the shadows. At 5:30 in the morning, his usual wake-up time, Robert got out of bed. He made coffee, sat at his kitchen table with his speech, and read it one more time. Then he got dressed in the one good suit he owned, the one he'd bought 15 years ago for his mother's funeral, and headed to the school. The graduation ceremony was scheduled for 2 p.m. The gym had been transformed with chairs, a stage, decorations in the school colors. Robert spent the morning helping set up because old habits die hard. Several students and teachers stopped him to wish him luck. Each time, he felt his anxiety spike higher. Dr. Morrison found him backstage an hour before the ceremony. How are you holding up? She asked. Terrified, Robert admitted. I've been invisible for so long. What if I freeze up there? Then you freeze and we wait and you start again. Robert, these people aren't here to judge you. They're here because they care. The students voted to have you speak instead of having a traditional commencement speaker. They chose you. That information somehow made Robert feel both better and worse. The gym filled with families, students in their caps and gowns, teachers and community members. Word had spread about the janitor who was giving the keynote speech, and the local newspaper had sent a reporter. The room buzzed with conversation and excitement. Robert waited backstage, his hands shaking, his mouth dry. He could hear the principal welcoming everyone, going through the usual graduation formalities. Then he heard his name. And now, for our keynote address, I'm honored to introduce someone who has been part of Lincoln High School for 35 years. He's mopped our floors, fixed our lockers, and kept this building running. But he's also been something else entirely. A quiet scholar, a dedicated learner, and now an inspiration to our entire community. Please welcome Robert Hayes. The applause was immediate and thunderous. Robert walked onto the stage, his legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. He looked out at the sea of faces. In the front row, he saw Beth giving him a thumbs up. He saw Ms. Rodriguez smiling encouragingly. He saw students he'd watched grow from freshmen to seniors. He stepped up to the microphone and pulled out his speech. The paper trembled in his hands. "I'm not sure what I'm doing up here," he began, his voice shaky. "For 35 years, I've been the person you don't see. I've been background noise, part of the furniture. And that was okay with me. It was safe there in the invisible spaces." He paused, taking a breath. "When I was 16, I had to leave school. My mother was sick and we needed money for medical bills. I took a job at a factory, worked double shifts, and told myself that education was something for other people. People with money. People with opportunities. People who weren't me." The gym was completely silent now. Even the restless younger siblings in the audience had stopped fidgeting. "But here's what I learned," Robert continued, his voice growing steadier. "Education doesn't belong to anyone. It's not owned by schools or universities. It's not something you can only get if you have the right circumstances or the right amount of money. Education is something you take for yourself, in whatever way you can." He told them about the library visits, the online courses, the notebooks full of thoughts and questions. He told them about listening outside classroom doors during his breaks, about reading every book he could find, about staying curious even when the world told him his curiosity didn't matter. "You're all graduating today," Robert said, looking out at the rows of students in their caps and gowns. "You're moving on to college or jobs or whatever comes next, and everyone's going to tell you that this is the end of your education, or the beginning of your real education, or some variation of that." He set down his prepared speech. The words that came next weren't written down. They came from somewhere deeper. "But I want to tell you something different. Your education doesn't start or stop based on what building you're in or what degree you're pursuing. It's happening all the time, everywhere, if you choose to pay attention. The person serving your coffee might have insights that would blow your mind if you took the time to have a real conversation. The person fixing your car might have a perspective on life that could change how you see the world." Robert's voice grew passionate now, the fear replaced by something stronger. "We've created a society that judges people based on their job titles and their degrees. We assume that intelligence lives in certain places and not others. We give respect to some kinds of work and ignore others. But that's wrong. That's deeply, fundamentally wrong." He looked directly at Beth, then at Ms. Rodriguez, then back at the graduating students. "Every single person in this room has worth. Every person you meet on the street has worth, not because of what they do for a living or what letters come after their name, but because they're human beings capable of thinking and feeling and learning and growing. The person who cleans your office might be the most well-read person you'll ever meet. The person who checks you out at the grocery store might be writing poetry that would make you weep. You'll never know unless you look, really look." He paused, emotion catching in his throat. "I spent 35 years being invisible because I was ashamed. Ashamed that I hadn't finished school. Ashamed that I was just a janitor. Ashamed that my love of learning didn't come with credentials. But then a teacher saw me, and a student saw me, and they helped me understand that my story mattered, that my learning mattered, that I mattered." Robert looked down at his hands, then back up at the audience. "So my challenge to you, graduating class, is this. See people. Really see them. Don't let job titles or appearances or circumstances blind you to the wisdom and humanity all around you, and never ever stop learning. Not because you need it for a job or promotion, but because learning is what makes us fully human. It's what connects us across time and space to every thinker and dreamer who came before us." He smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "I'm 62 years old, and next month I'm starting college. I'll be the oldest freshman you've ever seen, sitting in class with people 40 years younger than me. And you know what? I can't wait, because it turns out you're never too old to step out of the shadows. You're never too old to let your voice be heard. You're never too old to become who you were meant to be." The applause started slowly, then built into a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Robert stood at the podium overwhelmed, tears streaming down his face. Beth was crying. Ms. Rodriguez was crying. Half the audience seemed to be crying. When Robert finally left the stage, students mobbed him. They wanted to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him their own stories of hidden talents and secret dreams. Parents approached him with tears in their eyes, saying his speech was the most meaningful thing they'd heard in years. The local newspaper article about the speech went viral. Within a week, news outlets from across The country were covering the story of the janitor scholar who gave a graduation speech that challenged how society views education and worth. Robert's phone started ringing with interview requests, speaking invitations, even a literary agent interested in his notebooks. It was overwhelming and terrifying and nothing he'd ever imagined for himself. But through it all, Robert kept his promise to Dr. Morrison. He continued working at Lincoln High School, though now only part-time. 3 days a week he cleaned hallways and fixed lockers. The other days he attended classes at the community college, sitting in the front row, eagerly participating in discussions, finally getting the formal education he'd pursued in fragments for 4 decades. The scholarship from Dr. Chen turned into something bigger. The community college created a program for adult learners inspired by Robert's story, offering support and resources for people who'd been away from formal education for years. Robert became a spokesperson for the program, sharing his journey and encouraging others who thought they'd missed their chance. Beth and the Hidden Scholars Project continued throughout the summer and into the next school year. They documented dozens of stories now, creating a powerful archive of hidden wisdom and overlooked brilliance. The project won state recognition and inspired similar initiatives at other schools. Ms. Rodriguez published an article in an education journal about Robert's story and what it revealed about how schools define and recognize intelligence. It sparked a broader conversation about accessibility, adult education, and the ways institutions can inadvertently exclude brilliant minds. A year after that graduation speech, Robert stood in the same gym for another ceremony. This time he was graduating, receiving his associate's degree, with plans to continue toward a bachelor's. Beth, now a freshman in college herself, came back to watch. Ms. Rodriguez was there, beaming with pride. When Robert walked across the stage to receive his diploma, the applause was just as thunderous as it had been at that graduation speech. But this time Robert didn't feel afraid. He felt like he was exactly where he belonged. After the ceremony, a young man approached Robert. He was maybe 19, wearing a fast food uniform, clearly having come straight from work. "Mr. Hayes," the young man said nervously, "I saw your speech online. I dropped out of high school 2 years ago because I had to work. But your story made me think maybe it's not too late for me. I'm enrolled for next semester." Robert shook the young man's hand, feeling tears prick his eyes. "It's never too late," Robert said. "Trust me on that." As Robert walked out of the gym that day, diploma in hand, he thought about the 16-year-old boy who'd left school to care for his mother. About the decades spent learning in secret, hiding his passion for knowledge like it was something to be ashamed of. About the fear and shame and invisibility that had defined so much of his life. And then he thought about Beth's question. That day she'd first discovered his secret. Why do you do it? The reading, the learning, all of it. If nobody knows, if you don't get any credit, why keep going? He finally had an answer that went deeper than what he'd told her that day. He did it because learning had saved his life. It had given him dignity when the world tried to take it away. It had connected him to minds across centuries, made him part of conversations that transcended his circumstances. It had turned a small, lonely life into something vast and meaningful. And now, by sharing his story, maybe he'd helped save someone else's life too. Maybe that young man in the fast food uniform would go on to do something extraordinary. Maybe Beth would continue asking questions that challenged the world's assumptions. Maybe Ms. Rodriguez would inspire other teachers to see the students and the janitors in front of them more clearly. Robert walked into the late afternoon sunshine, his diploma under his arm, his future stretching before him in ways he'd never dared to imagine. At 63 years old, he was just getting started. The invisible man had finally been seen. And in being seen, he'd helped others see themselves and each other more clearly. That, Robert thought, was a pretty good definition of education after all.